Greetings, students. It is time for us to talk about a very important concept in social work practice, and that is ethics, values, and we can also spend a little bit of time talking about the Code of Ethics. This is, mm, how should I even frame it? This is Social Work 101. This is the basis of what we do as professionals. And so it's very, very important that we really pay close attention to understanding what these particular ethics and values of our particular social work profession are about. And so without any further ado, let's kind of jump into this scenario, or should I say into this lesson for today. So when we think about ethics, this definition rings true. Um, the system of principles and rules that concern duty, um, and it kind of cuts across all of these particular areas. I like this definition because it's nice and it's broad, and it has applications in many different arenas. So, for example, when you think about going to the doctor, you're not feeling well, you've got an illness, you might be suffering with a disease, and you're in need of medical care. There's a system of ethics that involves treatments, what doctors should be doing, what's actually the responsible thing to do. So every doctor takes an oath to do no harm, the Hippocratic oath. So there are some ethical principles. So they make decisions based on the ethics that are associated with their profession in terms of how they deliver consistent, reliable care to the patients that they serve. And so when you start to think about other professions, you think about lawyers. Lawyers have a code of ethics. Social workers have a code of ethics. Most professional entities, in some form or fashion, have a code of ethics that they adhere to, which really guides their practice. So, it's just about really at the end of the day, just doing the right thing. What's the right thing to do in the situation that you may find yourself in working with this work? So now, these are some areas that I want to make you all aware of in terms of social work risk areas. So these are things that you need to pay really, really close attention to as you are making decisions, as you are working within agencies or on your own as an individual professional. These are the things that tend to create the greatest amount of risk for social workers, for you as professionals, and can result in some pretty severe consequences, jail, being sued, losing your license. So making sure that we understand that clients have rights. And so when you're initially doing your meeting with your clients, really explaining to them what their rights are as it relates to how you are working with them, what's the scope of the work that you do with them. Confidentiality and privacy, key concepts that you got to keep in mind. You can't just give out information, or people can't call you and ask for information about a client. You can't even, in most instances, either confirm or deny whether you're working with an individual, which is a phrase that I use quite a bit in terms of the work that I've done over the years when I would get a call and folks would want to know, well, I got this situation going on and I heard that you're the social worker. I can't confirm because that violates privacy. So making sure that you do not release information about clients unless you have their express permission to do so. Informed consent. So as you're gathering information as a social worker, what's going to happen with that information, who has access to it, who can see it. Those kind of things are really important. So being able to explain to clients up front when you're meeting with them about where your information is going to go, what kind of things are happening with your information, who has access to it, who doesn't have access to it. Boundary issues, making sure that you have really clear boundaries in terms of your working relationship. So, you're in the social work profession, you're working with individuals, you're working with families, and the work is actually done within the context of the working relationship. So we have to be very careful to pay attention to boundaries, to make sure that we are staying professional in our role, that it's not bleeding or starting to look blurry. There will be times where you may have situations where clients will be attracted to you or you'll be attracted to clients, and that's an absolute no-no in terms of um, a boundary issue. So being really careful with how you make decisions, what kinds of decisions you make, what kind of positions you find yourself in as you're working with clients. Those are all boundary issues. So documentation is very, very, very important. There's a whole section in another video lecture that talks about the importance of documentation. My advice to you is this: is simply, if you didn't write it, it didn't happen. And you should really look at all forms of client records as legal documents because they can be subpoenaed by courts. And so what you have in those records, as well as what you don't have in those records, can be very damning. And so making sure that we understand the importance of that, um, making sure that you don't defame people's character, how you describe clients. If you are doing a consult and you have permission to, for example, share information with a group of folks that are working with this particular family, the treatment team, for example. Defamation of character really involves you defaming your clients. And so being very respectful and making sure that you are doing things in a upfront and just way. Client records, confidential, should be kept under lock and key in most instances. And because again, that whole confidentiality and privacy piece is, so if you have situations like this, there's a situation with former student years ago who was doing internship at a prestigious hospital and was working, was very busy, and actually ended up meeting with a client in a common area at the client file, left the file in the area. They didn't find it for several hours. And so that was a huge issue because all the client's medical information and other records were there, but it had been left in a common area, so anyone could have come along and see that. So it was a clear violation of client confidentiality. Supervision, making sure that you are double checking the work that you're doing, the decisions that you're making with a person who is in a supervisory position over you. So this is going to be true when you're in your field placement, as well as when you're actually working as a social worker. To just don't make blind decisions based on what you think is a good idea on your own. Use your social work principles to guide you through making that decision, but always check with your supervisor to make sure that you are making the right decision within the context of the law, in the context of the Code of Ethics, as well as within the context of agency policy. And sometimes they can be different. Um, Making sure that you get clear consultation when you have difficult situations that you're working through, making sure you're referring clients to the appropriate service providers, making sure that you're not involved in fraud, double billing for services, or um, anything of that nature. Termination of service with clients. You know, termination can be planned or as well as unplanned. But again, social work is a planned social change process. And so we're planning from the very beginning to actually end our services. So making sure that we do those things in a timely manner and letting clients know that the work that you'll be doing with them will be ending at a designated time. And shouldn't be an apparent, shouldn't be an shouldn't be a surprise to them as you're getting ready to close those particular cases. Practitioner impairment. This is an area where folks find themselves getting in trouble. So social workers and practitioners are people like everyone else. We experience some of the same traumas and difficulties and ailments that sometimes our clients do. And so if we've got a practitioner, for example, who is having a hard time, who is drinking, who was under the influence, who may be using drugs, for example, then that particular practitioner is impaired. And so, you know, it's probably not a good idea to continue to try to provide service to clients when you're under the influence of a drug, when you may need to be in treatment. And it could have serious implications for your license, as well as evaluation and research, making sure that if you are utilizing client information as a form of research, that you get permission from that client before you do that, as well as informed consent, so they will know exactly how the information is going to be used. So these are just some of the areas, or some of the main areas, that social workers find themselves having great amounts of difficulty because they don't pay attention to the warning signs that are here. So making sure that you understand these things. Um, Making sure that you understand agency policy. Literally every quality professional agency that you will work in will have a policy and procedures manual about how literally to do everything. So making sure that you stay within the bounds of what the agency policy is, what good social work practice is, and what the actual laws are. And so if you do those things, it won't be an issue for you. So always ask yourself, as you're making decisions, this is consistent with agency policy? Is this consistent with the law? Is this consistent with other regulations that govern this particular entity? For inadequate and absence of documentation. I can't say it enough for you in terms of making sure that if you didn't write it, it didn't happen. Um, there have been if it's important for a number of reasons. One, you don't have a clear record of what you have done in terms of your work with your client. Two, if you need to pass this particular case on to someone else um, for ongoing services, if you don't have records, they're not going to have any idea what it is you've actually done. It's a poor representation on you. It's a poor representation on the agency that you work with. And if it's a court case, you could get in some pretty significant and serious trouble for not having the documentation there. Again, those boundary violations, blurring. So a rule of thumb would be, as you're working with a client, are you doing things with this particular client that you wouldn't do um, in, let's say, the company of your colleagues or your family? If you've got some questions about that, then it's probably you're blurring those lines. So we need to make sure that we're not doing that. Being isolated and a lack of supervision, big issue. So if you find yourself, as social workers often do, with huge caseloads, with lots of work that they need to do, more work than they actually have time to do, and they isolate just to kind of hunker down and get it done, and they're not getting proper supervision, at some point you're going to make a mistake, and it could be a very costly one. So again, making sure that you are making decisions in the presence and with the company of others who are aware of the work that you're doing, as well as getting supervision on a regular basis from your supervisor. Here's some other issues and things that we need to keep in mind as well as we think about views. Everyone here is here because we enjoy working with people, because we want to help, we want to leave situations better than we found them. And those are all noble and very important things for us to keep in mind. But the other piece is that sometimes social workers get themselves in the place where they don't know how, don't need to, don't ask for help. So one, making sure that, you're not working to resolve unmet personal needs. So, if there's something happening in your life, you can't vicariously get that fixed or resolve that through your work with your families. Transference issues, unresolved transference issues. So this client is triggering something for you from your own family of origin. That's something that needs to be addressed and dealt with, because you will end up treating the client in an unethical manner if it's not, as well as countertransference. So is their client, are you triggering something in that client and they're responding to you in that way? Lack of knowledge and skills. Stay in your lane, stay in your pay grade. You're an LSW, you're working with family case management, you don't have the authority to do a mental health diagnosis for an individual. That's out of your skill sets. Doing so can create lots of issues. The belief in invincibility. A lot of good social workers I've met over the years can do it all. No one can do it all. So making sure that you don't fall into that trap, as well as decision-making ability, not being vigilant or open to possibility. If there's only one way that you work with a certain set of circumstances, then how fair are you being to the families that you're working with? So we need to keep those things in mind. Lack of professional training. Social workers and social work and working with the human environment, or should I say element, is an always evolving dynamic process. So there are things that I learned when I became a social worker many, many, many years ago that I have to continue to, reinforce, as well as sometimes those things change. And so as different research is made available, different techniques come about, I have to stay, as well as you will have to stay in a situation where you're continually training to make sure that you're on top of the latest skills, trends, and techniques that are happening in the social work profession. As a matter of fact, licensed social workers have to do, I think, 40 CEUs or continuing education credits over a period of 2 years just to get your license renewed, because we're that serious about it. Again, that sense of unclear boundaries and the unable to admit, that things may be more unrealistic or tougher than you think they are. These are all things that you need to be aware of, and if these are things that start to happen for you in the context of your social work practice, get some help because it's going to become problematic for you. Some of the most common areas of social work misconduct, again, is this: it's working beyond the scope of your practice. If you don't have the credentials to make the call, don't just think that social work is a one size fits all and you are able to do anything. Sexual misconduct keeps more people out of the field or gets them kicked out of the field than you can actually imagine. So making sure that you understand that importance of boundaries in relationships. The reality is that there will be people that you work with over the course of your time as a professional that you will be attracted to, and vice versa. It's up to you to be the responsible person because as a social worker, you are always held responsible. You're the person in a relationship with power. Something goes wrong, they're going to look at you. Um, Making sure that at any point in time that you have a client that you're working with that presents suicidal, then it's your responsibility to stop. Whatever it is you're doing, whatever treatment piece is going on for you, if you've got a client that's in front of you who's talking about ending their lives, then that's an immediate cry for help, and you go into a different mode in terms of assessing that particular risk for that particular client, calling 911 if you need to, but you cannot just ignore those subtle nuances when people talk about ending their life. It's very, very serious. And, the worst thing that could happen is if you were to, not follow through with a client who is threatening suicide or talking about it, and you just simply don't address it. Always address it. Ask point blank, are you thinking about hurting yourself? Get it from people's mouth and then take the appropriate steps based on that. Failure to report abuse is another one that gets folks in trouble. In social work practice, for the most part, there are pretty much two protected classes of individuals, and those would be children and those would be vulnerable adults. You have an ethical obligation if you come upon a situation where you suspect that a child is being neglected, harmed, and or abused, you have to make a report. You are a mandated reporter. It is not optional. It's something that you have to do to pick up the phone and call the local child protection agency to make a report. Same thing if you encounter a vulnerable adult. So if you've got a person who has significant disabilities, or a person who is elderly, or a person who, is fragile, um, and you become aware of the fact that people may be taking advantage of that, then it's your responsibility to report to adult protection to make sure that those vulnerable adults are actually protected. So don't drop the ball on that one. Really important stuff. And making sure that when you suspect something, you just need to have a conversation with your supervisor, but make the report. Even if it's screened out, you need to do your due diligence to make sure that you're not being negligent in making sure that folks are being cared for properly. And then breach of confidentiality. We see it all the time. Leaving files in the wrong place, having a conversation in a populated area. So basically, you just need to be very careful to make sure that the client's information is always protected. It's under lock and key oftentimes in most instances. Keeping your computer, your notes, all the things that pertain to your clients in a really safe manner are going to be important things to keep in mind. All right, so said a mouthful, but here's some things that you need to think about. Um, Literally, social work has a part of statute that is in law in literally every state. So you can go to your state statutes online, Google social work practice, and it will give you qualifications. It will give you training pieces. It will talk to you about what your responsibilities legally are as a social worker. And then we have the Code of Ethics. This wonderful, hang on a sec. This wonderful book that really guides. You can also access a copy of this online as well too, but it lays out pretty clearly what it is we need to do as social workers in terms of it takes the law into consideration, but it also talks about our ethical practice that we need to be involved in. And then also making sure that you understand, have a clear understanding of the agency policies, and not just to rely on, the patient, the supervisor, but to just know for yourself what those policies actually are. When we think about the NASW, the Code of Ethics, these are our 6 main things that we need to be responsible for in terms of our legal obligations. We have a duty to provide care. We have to respect privacy. We must maintain confidentiality. We must duty. We have to inform. We need to inform people about the work that we're doing with them. We have a duty to report if I encounter things that put other folks at risk. It's a kid or it's a vulnerable adult. Then I have a responsibility to report. And I also have a duty to warn. I have a duty to warn people about the information that they give me and the circumstances under which I may have to release that information if need be, if it's about keeping people safe. So just some things that are coming right out of the code that will help you understand. The other things that we need to also recognize when we think about the NASW Code of Ethics is that our 6 core values is about providing service, social justice. We're probably the only um, profession that has social justice in their actual core values. We also recognize the dignity and worth of every individual that we work with, regardless of the circumstances, where they come from, what they've done, what brings them to our attention. None of that matters. The importance of human relationships, understanding that social work is one of those unique fields in which the work gets done in the context of the relationship. So it's about how do you engage, establish all those 6 things that we talked about in gentleness practice methodology, making sure that the relationship is there and solid and genuine. Integrity, being above board, being honest, not trying to be dishonest or beat people out of, and then being competent, knowing what it is we're actually doing. We have 6 ethical standards and categories, and there's a whole section under each one of these particular topic areas that give real specific information about how we need to carry out those responsibilities. We have a responsibility to our clients. We have a responsibility to colleagues. We have a responsibility to the practice setting in which we work. We have a professional responsibility. We have a responsibility to the profession and the broader society in general. And so you have board of social workers that are set up in literally every state that govern social work practice under these particular auspices as well too. So making sure that we understand that piece. So for example, you know, my job is to provide the best quality service for my clients that I am actually able to do. Find the resources to advocate, to encourage, to empower, to do these things. I also have a responsibility to my colleagues, who are practicing social workers. If I witness a social worker doing something that is unethical or illegal, it is my responsibility to have a conversation with that social worker about what I'm observing and to let them know that they need to do something different as well as get help. And if that is insufficient in terms of changing the behavior, then I have an ethical responsibility to actually report that person to not only their supervisor, but to the board of social work who oversees their license. So again, it's that level of responsibility that I have. I can't just turn my head because you're my good social work buddy. But if you've got a problem and you're drinking alcohol 7 days a week and you're showing up at your client's house drunk and impaired, I have to report that. I do. You also have you have responsibilities to your practice settings to make sure that you are working within the context of the rules of that particular agency, and as a professional and to the broader society. So again, we're held to a higher standard um, in social work practice. So just recognize those things as well. Um, Making sure that we avoid these dual relationships or exploitative relationship with clients. Sometimes we're in situations where we're going to have more than one working relationship with a client. I got a client on my caseload and we go to the same church. That's a dual relationship. So we need to think about how we're going to mitigate and navigate those kind of situations. Avoiding discriminatory behaviors. I may just not like someone or someone has done an action, let's say they violated or they've assaulted a child. And children are very precious to me. I don't get the liberty of treating that person different because they did something that I don't like. So that can be a challenging piece as it relates to the code of ethics as well too. Every client deserves your absolute best. Um, restricting that treatment to the area of your competence, knowing what your limits are, refer to other situations when you need to. Um, Safeguard the autonomy of your client. You know, a lawyer can't call you and just say, I understand you're working with this particular person, and I need the X, Y, Z information about what's going on with this person. I can't even confirm or deny that I'm working with this particular client. If they don't have a signed release from that particular client, they're getting nothing. Um, Again, respect the rights, views, and clinical practices of other professionals. So our job isn't to get in and tell the doctors and the psychiatrists what to do, but to stay in our own lane. Hold accountable colleagues for their own ethical practice. This can be very tough in the small professional community in which we work. But if people are operating outside of the bounds, it's your responsibility to say, no, not okay, and we can't do that. May not make you a lot of friends, but it's going to keep you performing in an ethical manner. Continue to grow professionally. You never quite arrive as a social worker. You're always learning new things. Things are changing. Research is happening. So stay in training as much as you possibly can. Consult with other professionals when the circumstances dictate. Use your supervision. Adhere to the state, local, government laws and around confidentiality and any number of other things as well too. In the course of your time, you are going to experience ethical dilemmas. What's an ethical dilemma? Um, it's a conflict between one personal and professional values, a conflict between two values and principles, conflict that between two possible actions with the reasons being good for each. It's a conflict between unsatisfactory alternatives, conflict between the need to act and the need to reflect, and a conflict between one's values and principles and one's perceived role. So this is a mouthful, and so you'll often hear me indicate that social work is very rarely black and white. It's always shades of gray. So, what is the right thing to do based on the circumstances and based on the information you have? Um, let's say you're in a position where you have to make a decision. Um, so, for example, a real life situation that happened for some of my staff. There was a situation where we had a 16-year-old child who was in foster care, and she was staying with her grandfather in foster care. Now, mom was, dad was out of the picture. Mom was out on drugs, significant mental health issues, not in a position to parent at this particular point in time. Child couldn't be at the home safely. When the child is placed with the grandfather, she does well. She's going to school. She's following through the treatment plan. She's accountable with her time and behavior. Problem is that grandfather is living with a person who has a felony. Not something that's going to be a risk to the child, but it's a felony, and the laws or the rules of the agency is that you can't license a home where there's a person living there with a felony. So that means that this child, who's now 16 years old, has to go into a stranger-based foster care system. So not with people who she knows and relates to, or a shelter system. Problem is when she goes into those shelter systems, she stops going to school and she disappears. She's running the streets. She's pretty street smart. She's pretty savvy, um, but she's gone for weeks on end, which puts her at risk. You're the child protection worker. Your job is to keep this kid safe. That's the whole reason why you have her there. The agency has been real clear. You can't place with grandpa because it's against our rules. But if I place somewhere else, which I have done, then I got a kid who's missing for different points in time, um, and I can't keep her safe if I don't know where she is. What decision do I make? Am I concerned about the child's safety? Does the precedence go to the agency policy? What do I do? So it's situations like that where I got to make a decision based on the information that I have at the time, and that's an ethical dilemma. So you will see those oftentimes, and I would say get consultation. And then also there's an ethical decision-making problem-solving process that we have also that you can utilize. And speak of the devil, here it is. So again, when you're looking at finding yourself in these types of situations where you've got to make a decision, then there are pretty much 8 steps, and it's about really starting to identify what that conflict is, the ethical issues, who's involved, get some feedback from different people, attorneys if need be, evaluate the dilemma, look at all of these things in terms of the code of ethics, the legal principles, the social work practice, look at culture, personal values, those particular things, agency policies that may apply. Look at all of your possible options. What are all the things that I can do when I get all this information? Identify the possible outcomes for each. Some if I do this, this might be the result, but it's going to create issues over here. So really kind of one by one to walking through those options and looking at what's going to make the most sense based on the information that you have right now and based on what's needed right now. And then the eighth step is to make a decision based on what's going to help you reach your goals in the most ethical manner with the information that you have at the time, and then monitor, evaluate, and document your decision so they will know that you got to it based on those kind of things. So this brings pretty much to a close my piece around this, but the issues around ethical behavior are just continual and they're ongoing. So it is always advisable when in doubt, uh, don't make those decisions in a vacuum. Don't make them on your own. Make sure that you get as much information from others who are working along beside you so that you can make the best decision for you uh, or for your client as well as yourself in those particular high stress times. So do your readings. We'll see you in class. Take care.